everybody. I'm Bethany, and this is the Bear All podcast. Today, I have my lovely sister and also an assistant professor in psychology, Christina. Did I give you that correct title?
Yes.
Assistant professor in psychology. And today, we're going to talk about some topics that I've briefly touched on in other podcasts, but now that I have a guest who actually has a little bit more knowledge, and an actual degree in these things, I feel more comfortable diving deep into them today. And she is my first guest. Like I said, she's also my sister. So we might be a little goofy. We might have some funny moments. This is the first time that I'm setting up all my audio equipment with another person on board. So I'm very excited. And all right, I'm just going to let you briefly introduce yourself a little bit, even though I just kind of gave a quick introduction.
Sure. So one thing that I think is probably helpful in terms of just like pure transparency's sake, by no means am I a clinician. So a lot of where I approach these things come from either research or in terms of like applied aspects for teaching. So I'm not a clinician, definitely had lots of interest in kind of moving in that direction, but like the stars just haven't aligned to get there yet. I don't know, maybe someday down the road. Kind of the sub area of psychology, which is a super diverse field, and I could talk about it for hours and hours and hours, really is more in looking at how we apply psychology with groups, within organizations, and then really using that to kind of inform policies and practices. So if I may kind of like insinuate, I've listened to a couple things from previous iterations of the podcast. I think what I'm hoping I can kind of bring to this is also bringing in kind of like a big picture perspective, right? So like the individual lived experience, but how is kind of that interconnected to what we see on a bigger scale, a broader level? Because I think that's such a valuable thing, and also even forms as like a sense of validation. Like it's not just me, it's other people. That's why we have to push for collective change type of thing.
Yes,
so
absolutely. I also just wanted to say this was not planned, but she showed up today with two different sweaters to wear, and she was just like, hey, and then she's like, wait, are you wearing that? And we both wore like black and white cat shirts, and that just shows you that just like sister connection. We're like, cats. And of course, Gizmo may appear on the episode today, so if you hear little meows, that is him, of course, giving his very, very validated opinion. So we're going to pull up our notes because we kind of had some a very sort of like a niche type of topic that we wanted to talk about. I feel like I wanted to start off kind of talking about like our childhood and sort of like it being very like unconventional, but like also growing up, I would not classify us as middle class.
No.
We were very... what would you even like lower middle class? Not even. I would just say broke.
100% very in that realm of poverty, and in some instances really on the fringes of extreme poverty.
Yeah, no, we definitely were constantly penny pinching. I remember there were times where like we weren't able to like have like a full Christmas, where people from like the church or different organizations would like donate stuff to our family because we weren't really we weren't in a comfortable financial place ever.
Definitely.
And I think that that's something that all of our siblings have really strived for, like in our adulthood, is like, how can I get out of that? And how can I figure out how to be better? And also like for me and everything that I'm doing currently with the podcast now is also like when you grow up in poverty, you definitely face these hardships with mental health that like I feel like everybody goes through crazy mental health things, but especially when you're growing up in poverty, there's just like a whole nother layer to it that's like, wow, we're already struggling. Let's struggle some more. So I just want to do like a little dynamic on our family. So Christina and I do have the same mom. Mm-hmm. We have different dads. And there are 3 other siblings from the same mom. So we grew up in a very big, wild, like crazy Italian household. Like that was just, there's a 5-year age gap between the two of us, which actually I had to call mom and confirm that. I was like, is it only 5 years? And she's like, Yes. And I was like, damn, okay. Like sometimes it feels like more.
She just called me old. Like, you caught that, right?
But I think that's something that like the two of us can really relate on is growing up in the 90s or early 2000s was a time where, and she has much more specific information on all this stuff that's like actually accurate. I don't know if you have any articles or anything that you would like to reference any of this stuff to. But if we do that, I can always provide links in the description. But growing up in that time, I really, really feel like we were on the verge of like medicine coming to the mental health world, where it was like, we had medicine that was, when you're like physically ill, we have medicines that can take care of us that like doctors knew like, oh, we have to really push the most amount on somebody for like this disease or this illness, and it's going to help fix them. So then when it came to mental health, I feel like it was like, oh, well, this child has this mental health issue, so we're just going to prescribe this medication that's like the fix all, and we're going to like give them the highest dosage to start. And then it was just like, I just remember like feeling like a zombie growing up. There were so many times that, and I remember it, like you and I would get in the car with mom and we'd go for long drives because like we live in a small town where they really don't have psychiatrists. So we would go for these long drives and we would go and see different psychiatrists. I don't even remember all of them. I just like remember like the little sand things on the table, and I'm like, oh, raking the sand. This is nice. And just like going around and seeing all these different doctors and having them tell me that like, oh, well, you just need this medication. It's going to help you focus and it's going to help you be better in school. And I just remember them making me feel like a zombie and just being like, well, why are we doing this and not trying to like solve the underlying issue of just like the fact that like I'm anxious, depressed, and clearly have PTSD from some of the things that happened in our childhood, like going through like extreme things, like having different people coming in and out of your life, having parents split up. Like divorce affects a child's brain in more ways than them just being sad and lonely. There's so many different things. So it's like, I'm very curious on like your perspective with like, what do you think about like in that day and age, like having children being medicated as heavily as they were, to like, how do you feel like it's being dealt with now, presently? Like, do you know anything about that? And is that something that you see a lot of people talking about? I know it's very different from the type of psychology and stuff that you're doing, but just from your personal experience, because this is something that we experienced as children.
Yeah. And even when you had kind of initially said like, hey, this might be something I want to talk about, like I instantly lit up because it's something though, even within my courses and other things that I do, it constantly comes up because it really is so like impactful and like pervasive, is really how we look at the definition of like health and wellness much more holistically now than we did previously. So if you kind of go back in time a little bit and look at the approach to mental health and how mental health was diagnosed, how it was treated, what was considered mental health, as well as what was considered mental illness, it has changed substantially. And one of the most seismic changes that's finally getting much more traction and integration within the medical field as a whole is a different model approach. Which is particularly the bio, psycho, and social model of health. So looking at the biological components, which tend to be kind of the much more traditional biomedical model, right? So kind of as you're alluding, like the idea of like, hey, something is wrong, we need to fix this or fix you, really looks at it from that idea of there must be something physically wrong within the body that has to be adjusted. Or tweaked or fixed or supported in some way, shape, or form. And then that psycho and social aspect really takes into consideration all of those other variables. So you already hinted at it. And to me, the thing that really comes to life is like, you're talking about a family and then children that grew up in a rural area chronically unsupported and underserved in terms of healthcare to begin with.
Yeah.
The fact that, having to travel over an hour to get to a hospital that actually had facilities and services available is pretty substantial. And for people that may or may not necessarily know kind of the differentiation between like urban and rural, it's like an hour covering like tons and tons of miles. It's not like I'm an hour in public transport. Like,
no, like it's like it literally like going 55 miles per hour. It takes an hour to get there. Not to mention, like, I remember the long and windy roads. And because I was a kid, I wasn't allowed to sit in the front seat. So I was always sitting in the back, and I had really, really bad, like, nausea every single time. Like, I would get car sick. Like, I would show up to the doctor's and run to the bathroom and vomit because I was like, ugh, like, I feel so sick. And then on top of that, it was like, well, then being on all these different medications. Like, I just remember being, like, chronically ill through my childhood because it was like so many different factors, and it wasn't all the time, but like even thinking about that now, I'm like, wow, like part of it could have been the medication, part of it could have been the fact that we were in a car for over an hour, and it was just like constantly these moving components that like somebody who does not have an even close to fully developed brain should not have to go through all of these things. And it definitely, like, it was so crazy because when I originally asked her to come on and be a guest, I was talking to her about, I've mentioned this before, I'm writing a memoir, and there's a chapter in that memoir that it was just titled Pills, Pills, Pills. And I was like, hey, can I read this chapter to you? And would this be something that you'd be interested in talking about? And it was just like the fact that like remember being prescribed so many medications because they thought I had ADHD, ADD. It was like, well, maybe these aren't like now as an adult looking at the symptoms and everything. I'm just like, I guess I could kind of see it, but putting an 8-year-old on heavy drugs that like change just like alter your reality in a sense was like, this is really intense. Like I just remember being like a zombie, not being able to do anything. It made me less chaotic, or maybe it made me seem more focused, but it truly just made me feel like I was like, my brain is shut off. I don't know what to do. And also because of that, like being in poverty, being like struggling financially, medicine cost money.
Oh yeah.
And I remember my like mom getting really, really mad that I was not taking the medication because she would always be like, this stuff is really expensive. I'm trying to fix you. And I'm like, I don't need to be fixed, and I'm not asking you to spend this money. Like, I'd love to have you spend the money so I could get like a little like those little iPod shuffle things. I was like, yo, $50. Like, yo, if the drugs cost this and this, I don't need them. Get me something that's going to help me like tune everything out in a different way. So it was just like kind of just wild thinking of it that way, like how truly it was like also that financial burden on our family that it was like, but I remember mom telling us these are expensive. And I was like, everything's expensive. We're broke.
True that. True that.
So it's just like kind of wild. And like, I mean, since I think I got off of any type of medication when I was around the age of 14 or 15. And I haven't been on anything since. And I truly think that like you were talking about, like how we have different types of therapy, like more holistic things, more natural, like I love doing yoga and meditation. I love going to therapy and talking about my problems. Truly, those have been the best forms of medication for me. I feel like anything chemically would really just sort of alter me in a way that I don't like. And it's just definitely been like a learning curve from that age up till now with the whole medicine withdrawal, you could say, like coming off of it and stuff. So
I think one thing that even as I've kind of like tried to piece together, okay, like what things would be really relevant and how do I kind of use this almost like professionally, but even personally to kind of make a semblance of like my own understanding of like, well, why did things kind of happen the way that they did, is really focusing on like how our mother is likely to have kind of like approached this experience, right? You're talking about someone, and I hope this is okay to share.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I've already
Okay.
told my mom multiple times. I'm like, Mom, I'll send you the episodes before they launch so you can confirm. But we may be talking some mad shit about you. No, I'm just kidding. We love you, Mom. We do.
But someone that had a really impactful, chronic, and extremely rare illness, right?
Yeah. Yes.
That spent their entire adulthood at the mercy of a medical system that really didn't understand what was wrong, or even how to like keep her living. So I feel like anytime there was a challenge, it was kind of like, oh my gosh, like we have to do these things. And then you're operating in a system where that's the automatic default, right? That's the route you have to go. But I'm going to tell you honestly, what would have been most helpful, and I'm grateful that like collectively as a society we're moving in that direction, is more the use of like traditional clinical application of psychology and even social workers. Like I'm going to tell you, that's really what we needed, right?
Yeah.
We needed somebody to understand like, hey, they're struggling with like basic human things like keeping a roof over their head, keeping food on the table, making sure they have access to basic medical care, making sure that they have a means to really be able to cope with the stress that they're experiencing because of the environment that they're being forced to operate in. And I mean that in the sense of like holistically us as a family, what we were trying to get through, right?
Yeah.
You know, 5 of us in a house with a mother that is chronically ill.
I remember back in the day when we still lived at our old childhood home, there was a nurse that would come once a week.
Yeah.
And because Mom had this IV stand with the curly cute things at the end for the vials to hang. And like I remember her like sitting on the couch and like this nurse would come in and hook her up to the systems, and she would sit there for like maybe it was an hour. I don't know. Time moves differently when you're a kid.
Yeah.
But I would just remember Mom being like hooked up and having fluids go into her arm because her immune system didn't work. And if she didn't do this, she might die. And I remember having that constant panic where I'm like, the nurse is coming to do good. So it was like, there was always like medicine in our life, like drugs, like were always part of our childhood. Even like, now like thinking about it, like just imprinted from watching Mom receive these medications so she could live. And it's just like, so it was just like, I think that maybe that was something for her where it was like, oh, something's wrong with your brain. We need to give you a chemical to help balance it. And because for her, it was receiving so many different medications that helped her balance out her life and be healthy, that I think that was like, especially, it was extremely advertised at that time as well.
Oh, so much.
Where it's just like, use Prozac to fix your kid's brain or something like that. And it's like, you know, you think cigarette companies are bad, which they are, but like, it's also like the pharmaceutical companies pushing out these drugs. It's like, is your 7-year-old misbehaving? Give him Prozac. And I'm just like, this is so wild that we're like, just, I'm like, when you read a Tylenol bottle, it says don't give to kids under the age of like 5 or something like that. But at 7, it's okay to give you an even harder drug.
Yeah.
Like, it's just like, when you think about that, you just like take a moment to really think about that. We're talking for all of our viewers out there who might have also gone through a similar experience. Like, we're trying to connect with everybody and be like, hey, like we went through it. And then being like, oh, no, so we're going to try a different drug. Like, I don't even remember the names of all the medications. I was just like, the blue capsule, the little blue pill, the white pill, the yellow capsule. And like, it was just like, that was very traumatic to me, and it affected me as an adult, even being able to take like Tylenol or Midol for cramps and pains, because that was just something that became so intense. So yeah, I mean, do you have anything else to say based off of what I just said? I know that was a lot.
Yeah, and not to get like too super nerdy with it, right? Because that's definitely where I'm like quick to gravitate towards. But really what's become so different kind of now is like a distinct shift where when we're really looking at people that are experiencing different challenges, and I use that word kind of broad and intentional, there's so many different ways we can now work to try to help people with them, right? It doesn't just have to be the basis of the use of medication, although I will say it can be such a value for some people. But equally, so can different therapeutic modalities, right? We could look at focusing on, cognitive restructuring, where you're trying to change or overcome thought patterns that really no longer serve you in a positive way, shape, or form, or adjusting or shaping behavior, or integrating the two. So it's so much more now. We're able to understand it with better complexity. We can put things in context a lot better to really get a good idea of how to help and have it be helpful help that we're giving people.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I really think that like in all of my years of being medicated to versus like now just having therapy where I'm talking about my problems and problem solving based on like would I say cognitive thinking is the right word. It's just like that for me has been so much more helpful while I've been able to be like, okay, like let me take this thing that's bothering me and let me dissect it mentally and then figure out, okay, what things do I need to apply in my life to try to fix this thing? Is it like just, rational, like, is it like just basic reasoning, or is this something that I do feel like I need a chemical to help fix me? I think that sometimes people like who have certain disabilities, truly medication can be so beneficial. Like I even do know people who have very extreme ADHD who have mentioned that like being medicated does help them. Like I had a friend, I asked if I could use his personal experience as like a little example. And he was like, when I was in school having ADHD, it was very, very difficult for me to truly focus and get things done. And then when I started taking some medicine, I was like, whoa, I can totally focus and get this stuff done. Like if I know I have a test and I take that medicine, I'm going to be able to get that test done and it's great. But then it also creates that weird thing like when you're on medication that like socially sometimes you feel weird integrating into things because you're just like, okay, well it helps me really focus, but now I also am not sleeping right, I'm not eating right. Like a lot of people who I know have been on medication, like their appetite changes so much, and then you have these issues with either gaining extreme amounts of weight or losing so much weight that it becomes truly unhealthy, and it's like trying to find that balance and everything. So it's like I've tried to like talk to so many different people who I know currently have ADHD because that's what I was told that I had. And I think I might have a little bit. There might be tiny little bit there because like
some traits.
Yeah, because like I mean I definitely procrastinate on certain projects, and I definitely like there's definitely some things that like show up as, but honestly I always just blame that on just me being an artist. Like I think that that's where it's hard for me to be like, oh well, is this actually like ADHD or is this me just being an artist? Because from my personal experiences in therapy and going and asking them like, hey, I was told at a young age that this was what was wrong with me. What do you guys think is wrong with me? And I've been told that they're like, no, you have anxiety, depression, PTSD, and a borderline personality disorder from having that trauma as a child. And I'm like, okay, so I don't have ADHD. Is there a medication that can fix these problems? And they're like, no, you just need therapy. You just need to go to therapy and really talk about these issues to help resolve them. And I think that that's just, for me, that's been the most healing thing. Like I've mentioned it before. I've been in therapy for now going on over 2 decades, which is crazy. Because like I'm like, damn, I'm that old? No.
There you go. Now that makes up for the comment earlier, right? You see, folks.
So it's just like, wow, like holy cow, like it's really been a long time healing. It's been a long time processing. I don't think I'm perfect. I don't think that I'm completely healed. I think that I've mentioned this before. I really think that like mental health issues, unfortunately, because they're things that people don't see. people don't sometimes take them into consideration as much as like when you have a massive scar somewhere in your body that somebody can see, they're like, oh wow, you were in a really bad accident. That must have taken you a long time to heal from. As we're like mental scarring, people don't see that. They only know it if you tell them. And a lot of times people don't want to talk about their stuff.
Sure,
you know,
sure.
like I'm very open and honest about the stuff that's happened in my life because that's helped me heal. But not everybody heals that way. And not everybody can sort of express the things that have hurt them and why it's hurt them, as we're like, you know, like I said, a scar on your body. Like, you know, I have a little scratch from Gizmo, and like people are like, yo, that's insane. And I was like, oh, my cat scratched me, it's not that big of a problem. My mental health is more is more scarring. I'm gonna pull up our notes because
Sure.
she actually Christina made these lovely diagrams for us, which I love visual representations. Is there anything that you would like to dive in from everything that I just said?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it might be worth kind of noting, and depending on like who you are and kind of what life experience you have, I think what's kind of insightful is like when you look at the parameters for different diagnoses, I kind of alluded to this earlier, right? Kind of what we deem wellness and illness changes, and it changes over time. And I always get super jazzed about this, and I'm sure other people are like, all right, simmer down now. No one else is that excited about it. But we're really moving towards like this comprehensive system. So a lot of the times people will quote line and verse from the DSM in terms of diagnostic criteria for different disorders, right? Which for those who might not know, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, it's put out by the American Psychiatric Association, so also kind of gives a flavor of it's really emphasizing kind of coming from that sphere of the medical model in terms of how we understand health and wellness. And now collectively, there's movement towards a more unified system that bridges across countries, across cultures. So now we have the ICD, International Classification for Disease, that's used as a parameter, and they're literally like aligning those two things together, which I think is super cool. So we really have...
I really don't know anything on this topic, which I find it very interesting, but I'm sitting like, wow.
Right.
This is interesting. This is exactly why exactly why I brought you on this podcast, is because you have a lot of really interesting insight that, while mine's more experience based in the things that I've processed in my life, it's very one-sided because it's my personal experience, as where it's really interesting to hear from other people who sort of are like, okay, well, I've studied and done some research on this, and while this might not exactly be my specific field, this thing is happening. I find that very like my mind just went poof. Like I'm just like, right? Wow, okay.
Like it really is like it's happening now. Like the 11th edition for the ICD just came out. Like it's incredible. And for me, it's almost like a part of it where it's like younger me is like, okay, we're finally doing the right things. We still have so much work to do.
Oh my God.
Like, please trust us.
We have so much work to do in so many different areas. Like, I really feel like I'm like, mental health is something that like within the last 100 years, if you look at like how it's developed and how we've taken into consideration that mental health is actually something that we really, truly need to focus on, because it's just as important as physical well-being. It's like, you know, they used to just think that like if you look at like the old psych wards and like the mental hospitals or whatever. No, we're not talking to you, Siri.
I
was like, what's happening? She's got some deep trauma. But no, like, I mean, think about it. Like, when you look at, like, even just old films that are, like, based from, like, the 40s and 50s, the things that they would do to people who had mental illnesses.
Sure.
It's just, like, thank God I was not born in that time, because they would have cut my brain open and taken out my frontal lobe. Like, it's really wild to think, like, how the technology for mental health has just advanced. Like, even on social media and just being spoken about in conversation, we can talk about mental health in a much more comfortable environment than we could even do as children.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, like the way that it was talked about, it was still like a almost like a dirty secret, like,
or like
that was
never
like,
explained, right?
yeah, it was just like, oh, Bethany's just got a couple screws loose. And I was like,
Which is not even fair, but
no, and I was like, or I was just like traumatized as a
Yeah.
child, and it made me a little like off. It made me uncomfortable. It made me feel weird. It made, honestly, I think it was like the fact of like the traumas that happened to me as a child, the fact that they were talked about in such weird ways, and like the stigma around the fact that like, oh, this thing happened, then it was just like that made me feel crazy, which then turned into me sort of becoming crazy. And I am saying crazy because that was like the terminology that we used.
sure.
I don't think that that's an appropriate terminology anymore, but it's just like, it's so crazy to see how like it's really changed over the last even just 25 years. And like then if you like look at like how it's changed in 100 years, I mean, they literally just used to like cut people's brains open and they're like, we're gonna move some things around because we don't know what else to do. And then it turned into like, well, they've got some problems, so we're gonna just like, you know, now we're gonna try these different types of medication, or you know, electrotherapy, or all these different things. Like I'm talking about like 100 years ago, and now into like, now it's medication growing up for us, and now it's turned into more like, all right, let's have like therapy, let's actually talk about what's wrong, let's try to like analyze what's actually happening, and was this caused by a significant event in your life, and or is this something that you were maybe born with? Like, I don't know enough about all the clinical professional things when it comes to this stuff. Like I said, this is just based off of my experiences, but it's just like, it's crazy to see how it's just developed, you know. It's like, it's kind of like similar where it lines up with like the whole women's rights things too. Like that, this is stuff I've talked about before on my podcast, where I'm like, women didn't have the right to vote. It was like 104 or 5 years ago that we got the right to vote. So it's like, same, like we are in such an interesting day and age where we have so many different technologies and mental health systems and just like overall open-mindedness that we've never had before. And I'm grateful to be alive during this time and figuring all this stuff out. But it's really wild that like, it's wild.
It is super wild.
I'm like, yo, I can't imagine being my grandmother.
Yeah.
Like I can't even imagine being my mother and the stuff that she went through with all like being in that time of like things changing, because we were like starting to be more progressive, but also not.
Yeah. So one particular model that I love, and I've used it in things that I've worked on, I've integrated it into lots of different things that I've worked with or on in some way, shape, or form, is Yuri Brofenbrenner's social ecological model, which I know is a bit of a mouthful, but
can you please repeat that for the viewers and me out there?
Yes. So Dr. Brofenbrenner's social ecological model was essentially put together to really try to understand and measure and assess how different layers of the environment have an impact on the individual. And layers of the environment, more so than just like physical space, but also people, places, things that happen, policies, all of those things. How does that really kind of come together? And when Brofenbrenner wrote the theory, he really approached it from a developmental psychology perspective, so focused on children. And it was really rooted in the idea, and I don't know, maybe if you're interested, we could always talk more about Brofenbrenner. I'm a big fan. Fangirl.
Brofenbrenner.
Brofenbrenner.
Fangirling over here.
So he was really focused on this idea of understanding essentially like resilience in children, right? How can they experience a variety of different things and still be resilient? How do they kind of overcome the odds, those challenges in some way, shape, or form, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, Gizmo wants your microphone. Here, make sure that's right in front of you too. There, so you're, yeah.
Okay. And through the model that's created from his work, it really looks at trying to understand the individual and then systems around them that have impacts on them, right? So the first layer is the microsystem, and those are things that are most immediate, closest to the person, right? So you could think about your friends, your family, chosen family, whoever that is, whoever means something significant to you in your life. And things that you do that matter, and also like immediately spaces around you, where you live, where do you go kind of on your free and leisure time, those type of things. And then beyond that, it starts to look at things that are kind of a little bit more separated, you interact with, but it's usually kind of a structured basis. So we could think like work, we could think school, we could think healthcare, we could think religious institutions, community spaces that you might interact with. And then it gets broader from that, right? What's kind of the interconnection between those interactions of things? Even bigger when we're talking about like, well, what is it like based on the state that you live in, the country that you live in?
Yeah.
What are cultural values and norms that have shaped our perception on things, and how do we respond to things, right? And then all of that being informed and bound based on time, right? I jokingly literally had a conversation this morning where someone had asked my opinion about like a couple events, and they were like, I'd be really interested. And I jokingly said, and I hope this is okay to say, that I feel like it's a privilege to live through historic times, but there's also a little part of me that's like, it'd almost be nice if it was a little bit boring once in a while.
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, if you think of like the major historic times that have happened, and you think about like, what was it like to live through that? And then we were hit with a pandemic.
Yeah.
And then we were like, oh my God, we are living through history right now. Like this is going to be talked about in hundreds of years to come.
Sure.
Because we still talk about like when the Black Plague hit, and when like other huge historical like medical phenomenons happened in time. So it's just like, I'm like, yo, this is like, it's cool, but this is stressful, and I'm just like, I just want to go to the grocery and buy eggs and like cook something and not have to be like, oh my God, are we gonna die today? Like it was like a really stressful time to live through, and like even just like economically, it's been an interesting time to live through. Like socially, with everything that's happened, like in people coming out about different things that haven't been talked about. Like I feel like even mental health is, like I said, it's like 100 years ago, this was dealt with in a very different way. And like coming back to now, it's like the things that we're transitioning through in this period, like I feel like from like the 90s, maybe not even the 90s, but like the 2000s have been such an interesting roller coaster of time. I mean, like we were both born in the 90s. I was like towards the tail end of it. So it's just like the 2000s were my childhood. And like seeing how things have changed up till now, like going through that crazy wild time, it's so interesting to see. But also you mentioning like location and like where you live. Like I know that like our mental health that we're dealing with now in the United States, and specifically like northeastern United States, we're in New York. This is we live in a very open-minded state. Mind you, we grew up in the country, so we grew up in a very closed-minded area. But generally in New York State, we have a lot of different open-mindedness that isn't happening in everywhere in this country, let alone in the world. Like getting to know people, like that was one of the great experiences of going to college. And what I truly believe that college will help you is giving you like open-minded to diversity. If I was to talk to somebody who comes from like a Middle Eastern culture, or even like a Southeast Asian, or like different types of cultures, they deal with their mental health in a very, very different way. Like personal people who I know, there's like, you know, like your parents just want you to go out and make the most money. And that's something that also affects the mental health too, because it's just like they don't take into consideration certain things that are like, oh, well, what if I want to do this or do that? And then when you want to be more open-minded, and I think that's just something that we deal with our parents in general sometimes in families. Like, oh, we want to be proud of you. But it's like, it's very, very different, like from the experiences that I've had from when I've talked with friends that were born in different countries, came to the United States and wanted to start off something new, like thinking about like their challenges and their mental health that they struggled with is very different from mine. And I mean, every person is completely an individual who has a completely different story. I think the thing that's nice about the two of us is we grew up in the same household. And while we have very different experiences, we also have the same experience, which is wild. It affected us differently, but we went through the same things at a young age. So it's just like so interesting to think about like how everybody in the world has these different experiences, but then going back to like, okay, like it is about what you were saying with that like chart where it's like it starts with what's happening to you directly versus what's happening to you outside of that versus then the world.
Yeah.
It's wild. Is that the chart that you sent me, this one
Yeah,
right here?
yeah.
I'm like literally looking at this chart and I'm like, I love visual representations because sometimes my mind can only expand so much.
Sure.
But then when I see a chart, I'm like, wow, that's like the solar system.
It literally does kind of almost look like it should be like
yeah,
a solar
just like-
system graphic.
Yeah, because it's like literally individual, the microsystem, the mesosystem, exosystem, and then the macro system, which is, this is the first time I'm seeing this chart. I only took like one psychology class, no, two psychology classes in college, but this was not the type of stuff that we were talking about and stuff. That was like more Freud, all that.
Freud always gets a little more airtime than he should. And
I feel like, no, I feel like that's very, very true because I feel like walking out of my psychology classes, I was like, all I know is about this man, Sigmund Freud.
Scandal.
And it was just weird.
Yeah.
Weird stuff where I'm like, huh, I don't know how I feel about I feel like I need therapy from going to my psychology class.
I will say, for those of you, if there's any Freud fans out there, no tea, no shade, no pink lemonade. However, there is some limitations in terms of the initial basis. You do have to give credit where credit is due. Did he really play a seismic role in the field as a whole? Absolutely. But please know, if you've never like dabbled back in psychology since that point, we have changed substantially, right?
Yeah. I mean, mind you, this was also almost 5 years ago that I was taking these
Freud
courses.
still comes up even today. People still bring him up, but it is like kind of like that's where we started, and we've come very far and different in it.
And I will say that mine were just like beginner psychology classes, to just fulfill a credit. So it's
fair,
like,
respect.
so I'm like, I understand why we're talking about this, but I do find psychology very fascinating. It's something that I've always personally wanted to dive into more, specifically in the realm of like, even with this podcast, like I'm trying to find ways to heal the world in direct experiences that people have had and sort of trying to like, okay, well, let's figure out why you're behaving this way now based off of like the things that you've been through. And there's been so many times where I've been able to connect with friends who clearly seem like they're on the edge of like doing some crazy stuff, behaving weird, having these sort of awkward, like, social cues is what I was looking for. And then like when you sit down and actually have a conversation and then they tell you more and I'm like, oh, well, you're doing this because that is like a trauma response or something like that. And for me, it's like, I've always loved art. Art has been a big, huge part of my healing process. And I feel like that's what I'm trying to connect with. So it's like, you're coming from this, I wouldn't say textbook, but like you understand a lot of things that are in the textbooks and
Sure.
in the classes that I don't necessarily understand because I've never taken them. But I'm just coming from like, what have been the things in life that have helped heal me? And it's like music, art, meditation, and just like really, really long conversations with my therapists or even my good friends that have been like these things that have helped me process stuff and learn more about myself and be like, oh wow, I never thought of that. Like when you and I had the conversation about like when I talked to you about my chapter, and we had a deep conversation about the fact that we were like, we grew up really poor.
Yeah.
And I didn't even realize that like the poverty that we grew up in was a huge part that was playing into our mental health. But then when I look at somebody who maybe grew up in a much more well-off, well-to-do family, they still got problems.
100%.
But their problems are very different.
Yes.
But they can still relate, like in certain things where I'm like, wow, that's so crazy to like think like you can grow up and not have the financial difficulties and still have the same type of mental health struggles and like, you know, not feeling valid about yourself, or, you know, like different things when it comes to like, you know, your emotional or physical awareness of yourself. So it's just so interesting to like, this is not just you that has the problem. Remember this, everybody out there, it's not just you.
Yeah.
It's literally everybody in the world that has a different thing going on. And this is something that I've tried to do more, and I try to encourage other people, and I'm not the best at it. But like, you know, when you're in traffic and somebody cuts you off and you just like start screaming, and then like and then they kind of like, sometimes you can tell that they're panicking, they're like, oh shit, I did something wrong. It's just like everybody has something going on in their life. So like try to be a little bit more like courteous, or try to like keep your, I think having an open mind is truly the best way to deal with life. So I don't do it all the time. Sometimes people at the grocery store really do bother me. But like, you know, when somebody's like scanning your groceries too slow, don't get angry at them.
Yeah.
Because like, you don't know what they're going through. You don't know if right now they're having a triggered moment because somebody came through the aisle that reminded them of someone from their childhood that traumatized them, and they're like triggered and their brain isn't working. So then now they're suddenly slower. I mean, they could just be lazy as hell, but they could also be somebody who's like triggered or something like that. Sorry, I'm kind of like ranting off on all these different things, but that's kind of like, it's just like, it's all these little moments in life and all these different things where it's like, sometimes you really have to try to put things into perspective and realize, hey, I'm not the only one on this planet with problems. Everybody has problems. And if I start looking at that, like, okay, everybody has their own things, then maybe I can have a little bit more grace and open-mindedness when it comes to conversations or accepting things or dealing with people's strong personalities or lack thereof. And you have another diagram that I...
Oh, yeah.
This
That's
one's
like for the first one, kind of like
Okay.
the three pieces, the biopsycho.
Oh, okay. Yep.
Yeah.
But, yeah, I think we're just in such a different day and age right now that, like, it's just from, like, the early 90s, 2000s, being now, and it's kind of, every time I say it, 2024. Oh, my God. I remember, like, being a kid and being like, I'm always going to have the 2 zeros in the middle.
Now it's gone.
And I'm like, it's gone now.
Yeah.
But I mean, do you feel like we touched on all the topics that I'm looking at our notes, and we really pretty much did touch on all the topics that we wanted to. I truly find all of this to be such a unique and interesting healing journey, to be able to sit with my sister and talk about this stuff as like adults who have now really processed a lot of that stuff. Because like when we were children, we could not properly communicate to each other what was going on. And there was like, our household was constantly like anger, fighting, yelling, you know, having to lock your sister in a dog. That is something that I will talk about on a future episode if I can get my youngest sister on as a guest. we had so many different things in our childhood where it was just chaotic off the walls all the time. So it's still chaotic off the walls when we all get together because we're loud Italians.
That's true.
But it's very different now.
Yes.
And I think we're probably just going to wrap this episode up because I feel like we really touched base on everything. I just want to say thank you guys so much for joining us on today's episode. Thank you so much, Christina, for joining me on this. Like I said, this is my sister, like actual sister. And this was really fun to just sit down and talk about all this stuff today. And I hope to see you guys all on some future episodes. If you are a person who wants to share an interesting story, please feel free to reach out to me. Again, I'm Bethany Autumn with the Bear All podcast. Today, my guest, Christina. And I hope you guys all have a wonderful day. Bye.